Stubborn Karen tries to grab a royal guard's gun. What he did to her shocked everyone. The bustling crowd in front of Buckingham Palace was interrupted by a jarring scream. A woman with fiery blonde hair and a look of determination on her face lunged at one of the stoic royal guards, her fingers grasping for the sleek black rifle resting on his shoulder. Gasps echoed through the tourists as cameras clicked in disbelief. The guard, unmoving for what seemed like an eternity, suddenly sprang into action. His precise movements shocked everyone as he firmly twisted her arm away, forcing her to the ground with calculated force. The sound of her protest, mixed with the guard's clipped command, hung in the air. A moment later, 3 more guards surrounded them, rifles pointed, their faces unreadable. The woman, defiant even as she was restrained, shouted something that sent a ripple of murmurs through the onlookers. The air felt electric, buzzing with a mix of fear and anticipation. What had driven her to such an act? The answer, tied to the undercurrent of her words, would soon be revealed. But as the guards stood their ground, and the woman refused to relent, the crowd realized this was no ordinary tourist outburst. Then came the sound of approaching sirens. Karen stepped off the tour bus, her head high and her steps purposeful. She had arrived in London only 2 days earlier, eager to immerse herself in the history and culture of England. Yet, her confidence often came off as overbearing, and her sharp tongue had already left an impression on several hotel staff members and tour guides. Karen was convinced she knew best, no matter where she went or whom she met. This trait was amplified during her visit to Buckingham Palace. From the moment she saw the royal guards in their traditional uniforms, standing motionless in the face of the tourists' antics, Karen became fixated. She dismissed them as props for the monarchy, sneering at their disciplined stillness. Her behavior began with mocking remarks. "I bet they're just actors," she said loudly, pointing at one of the guards. A small group of tourists chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to agree or distance themselves from her comments. Emboldened by the attention, Karen moved closer, snapping photos of herself next to the guards. When one of them maintained his stoic gaze, her frustration grew. "You're not so tough," she muttered under her breath. A young black couple standing nearby caught her eye. The man, wearing a camera around his neck, smiled and said, "They're trained professionals. It's their job to stand like that." Karen's face twisted into a scowl. "I'm just saying, it's ridiculous. What's the point? They're glorified statues." The woman beside the man sighed and turned back to her phone, clearly uninterested in arguing. Karen, however, wasn't finished. As the day wore on, her irritation festered. She watched the guards with a growing sense of disdain, convinced their calm exterior was a facade. What had started as mild curiosity transformed into an obsession. By the time she returned to the palace gates that afternoon, she had made up her mind. She would prove her theory, and in doing so, make herself the center of attention. The crowd had thickened, with families, tourists, and street performers filling the area. Karen edged closer to the line of guards, weaving through the spectators. The towering gates of Buckingham Palace loomed in front of her, but her eyes were fixed on the rifle slung over the nearest guard's shoulder. She felt a surge of adrenaline, her pulse quickening as she closed the gap. "Watch this," she muttered to no one in particular. Before anyone could stop her, Karen darted forward, her hand outstretched. The cold metal of the rifle brushed her fingertips as the guard's body shifted. What happened next took only seconds, but to Karen, it felt like an eternity. The guard moved with lightning speed, gripping her wrist and twisting it in a way that sent pain shooting up her arm. She let out a yelp, stumbling backward. Her plan to grab the weapon had failed, and now she found herself face to face with the very discipline she had mocked. "Step back," the guard commanded, his voice firm but controlled. Karen's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Instead of retreating, she shouted, "I have a right to be here. You can't treat me like this."
The
crowd, stunned into silence, watched as Karen continued to argue, her defiance unwavering despite her compromised position. That's when the other guards arrived, their synchronized movements reinforcing the seriousness of the situation. Karen's shouts grew louder, her words taking on a sharper tone. "They think they're better than us," she yelled, glaring at the guards. Her words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken implication that made the onlookers exchange uneasy glances. The earlier part of Karen's day had been far less dramatic. She had spent the morning at a nearby cafe, complaining about the lack of real coffee and the pretentious names on the menu. The server, a young man with a quiet demeanor, had offered her suggestions, but Karen dismissed them, insisting she knew what she wanted. Her tone, condescending and impatient, had drawn annoyed looks from the other patrons. It was this pattern of behavior, her need to assert dominance in every situation, that set the stage for her later actions at the palace. To Karen, the guards represented everything she despised: rigidity, tradition, and the idea that someone could hold a position of authority without question. But as she sat on the cafe terrace that morning, sipping the flat white she had grudgingly ordered, there was no sign of the chaos to
come.
The day stretched out before her, full of possibility. Little did she know, by evening, her actions would make headlines and spark a heated debate across the globe. Karen's defiance at the palace gates was far from over. Her determination to assert her version of reality clashed with the guards' unwavering duty. The tension grew thicker as the sirens approached, signaling the arrival of the authorities. And just as the first police officer stepped out of the car, Karen did something that would leave the crowd and the world speechless. Karen's face burned with indignation as the first officer approached. His calm yet stern demeanor only seemed to fuel her anger. She gestured wildly at the royal guard, still standing firm in his position, his rifle securely in his grasp. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "They attacked me for no reason. I'm an American citizen, and I demand you do something about this." The officer, a middle-aged man with sharp features, raised a hand to silence her outburst. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the guard's rigid posture, the murmuring crowd, and Karen's flustered appearance. He looked back at her, his voice steady. "Madam, we'll need you to calm down and explain yourself," he said. "Can you tell me what happened here?" Karen jabbed a finger toward the guard she had tried to disarm.
Him.
"He twisted my arm and hurt me. I was just trying to see if the gun was real. Is that a crime?" Now, a murmur rippled through the crowd, many of whom had witnessed the incident. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of Karen's version of events. The officer's brow furrowed. "You tried to grab his weapon?" Karen huffed. "I didn't try to grab it. I was just touching it. It's not like I was going to use it or anything. These guards are just for show, right?" The officer's expression hardened. "Madam, these guards are members of the British Army. Their weapons are not for show, and attempting to interfere with them is a serious offense." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "She's lying," a woman said, stepping forward from the crowd. It was the same woman who had ignored Karen's earlier rant about the guards. "I saw the whole thing." She went straight for his rifle. Several other onlookers chimed in, nodding and voicing their agreement. Karen's face paled as the weight of their words sank in. For the first time, she seemed to realize that the situation was spiraling out of her control. The officer turned back to her. "Is that true? Did you attempt to grab the guard's weapon?" Karen hesitated, her confidence wavering. But her stubbornness quickly resurfaced. "It doesn't matter what they say. I didn't mean any harm. This is a misunderstanding." The officer exchanged a glance with one of the guards, who gave a slight nod. "Madam, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us for further questioning." Karen's voice rose again, shrill and desperate. "Are you kidding me? I'm the victim here. This is outrageous." The officers moved closer, but before they could take her into custody, Karen made a sudden, reckless decision. She yanked her arm free from the officer's grip and bolted toward the gates of Buckingham Palace. The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding chaos. Earlier that afternoon, Karen had been on a guided tour of London, listening to a guide drone on about the history of the monarchy. While most of the group listened intently, Karen spent the entire time rolling her eyes and muttering under her breath. She found the whole concept of a royal family outdated and absurd. Why are people still obsessed with them? She whispered to a fellow tourist, a young man from Canada. They're just a bunch of rich people living off taxpayers' money. The man smiled awkwardly and nodded, clearly uncomfortable. Karen didn't notice, or didn't care. She continued her tirade, pointing out every perceived flaw in the monarchy's traditions. By the time the tour reached Buckingham Palace, Karen was visibly agitated. She watched as other tourists posed for photos and marveled at the grandeur of the palace. It baffled her that people could admire such an institution. But what irked her most was the reverence shown to the royal guards. They're just standing there like robots, she scoffed. What's the big deal? Her remarks drew a few curious glances, but Karen wasn't deterred. She made her way to the front of the crowd, positioning herself as close to the guards as possible. She stared at them, her eyes narrowing as she tried to provoke a reaction. When none came, her frustration boiled over. As Karen sprinted toward the gates, the guards sprang into action. The one she had attempted to disarm earlier stepped forward, moving with precision and speed. His commanding voice echoed across the courtyard. Stop. Do not move any closer. Karen ignored him, her determination blinding her to the danger she was putting herself in. She was mere feet from the gates when another guard intercepted her, blocking her path. The crowd held its breath as the guards closed in, forming a tight circle around her. Karen, now cornered, lashed out. She screamed and flailed, accusing the guards of targeting her unfairly. But her words fell on deaf ears. The guards remained stoic, their training evident in the way they handled the situation. The officer who had initially approached Karen stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. Madam, you're making this much worse for yourself. Stand down immediately, or we will have no choice but to restrain you. Karen glared at him, her chest heaving with exertion. You can't treat me like this. I know my rights. The officer sighed, signaling to his colleagues. Very well. 2 guards moved swiftly, securing Karen's arms and guiding her away from the gates. She resisted with every step, shouting and struggling against their grip. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their phones capturing every moment. As Karen was escorted toward the waiting police car, a voice from the crowd rang out. You only have yourself to blame, ladies. Laughter rippled through the onlookers, but Karen's defiance didn't waver. She turned her head, shouting one final declaration before being placed in the car. This isn't over. You'll all regret this. The crowd buzzed with speculation as the car pulled away, taking Karen to the nearest police station. But as the commotion died down, questions lingered in the air. What had driven her to such extreme actions? And what consequences awaited her now? Back at the palace gates, the guards resumed their positions, their stoic expressions unbroken. But for the tourists who had witnessed the incident, it was a day they would never forget. The story was far from over, and the ripple effects of Karen's actions were only just beginning. The police car sped through the streets of London, sirens wailing as Karen sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed and her face a mix of anger and disbelief. Her protests had simmered into muttered grumbles, but her mind raced, crafting arguments and excuses to get out of the mess she had created. The officer driving the car glanced at his partner. This one's going to be trouble, he said under his breath. Definitely, the other replied, his gaze fixed on Karen in the rearview mirror. She's already made a spectacle. This won't end quietly. When they arrived at the station, Karen was escorted inside. Her protests flared up again as they led her into a small interrogation room, the stark walls and single table a stark contrast to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace she had stormed away from just hours earlier. "You're making a big mistake," she shouted as the officers closed the door. "I'm an American citizen, and I demand to speak to my embassy." The officers ignored her for now, opting to let her stew while they reviewed the statements and videos flooding in from witnesses. Outside the room, the buzz of activity was palpable. The incident had already gone viral. Clips of Karen lunging at the guard and being restrained were spreading across social media like wildfire. Public opinion was as divided as it was heated. Back in the room, Karen sat with her arms crossed, fuming. She replayed the events in her head, convinced she had been wronged. To her, this was a gross overreaction, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. She had never considered the consequences of her actions. They were always someone else's problem. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and a man in a crisp suit entered. He was tall, with a calm, authoritative presence that immediately filled the room. He set a folder on the table and took a seat across from Karen. "I'm Detective Inspector Harris," he began, his tone measured. "I'm here to discuss the events at Buckingham Palace." Karen leaned forward, her eyes flashing. "Finally, someone who can listen to reason. This whole thing is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong. Those guards overreacted." Harris opened the folder, revealing photos and statements. He slid one across the table, a clear shot of Karen reaching for the guard's rifle. "This doesn't look like nothing," he said calmly. "You attempted to grab a weapon from an armed soldier. That's a serious offense, madam." Karen scoffed. "Oh, come on. I wasn't trying to steal it. I just wanted to see if it was real. It's not like I was going to use it or anything." Harris's expression didn't change. "The intent doesn't matter. What you did endangered yourself, the guard, and everyone around you. The guards are trained to respond to any perceived threat, and you gave them reason to act." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "I wasn't a threat. Everyone's just overreacting because I'm American." Harris's eyes narrowed slightly. "This has nothing to do with where you're from. It's about your actions. And your behavior afterward didn't help your case." Karen leaned back in her chair, her bravado faltering under Harris's steady gaze. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, there was a knock at the door. Another officer entered, handing Harris a tablet. "It's all over the news," the officer said quietly. "And it's getting ugly." Harris nodded, glancing at the screen. Karen craned her neck to see, her curiosity piqued despite herself. The tablet displayed a video montage of the incident, interspersed with headlines. "Tourist attempts to grab guard's gun at Buckingham Palace. Royal Guard maintains composure amid chaos. Privilege or ignorance." The internet reacts to Karen's incident. The comments scrolling beneath the video were even harsher. Words like entitled, reckless, and racist appeared repeatedly. Karen's face turned red as she realized the scope of her actions. Earlier that evening, the world had already begun dissecting the incident. Social media platforms were flooded with opinions, memes, and debates. Some criticized Karen's actions as a blatant display of entitlement, while others questioned the strictness of the guard's response. But one particular angle sparked the most heated discussions: Karen's confrontational words toward the black couple earlier that day. Clips from bystanders captured her dismissive remarks and the sharp edge in her tone. Coupled with her later behavior, many began framing her actions as not just reckless, but racially charged. Karen, oblivious to the growing narrative, remained defiant in the interrogation room. She folded her arms and glared at Harris. "So what now? Are you going to keep me here forever?" she snapped. Harris leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. What happens next depends on you. We can either work together to resolve this, or you can continue down this path and face the full consequences of your actions. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the door burst open. A woman in a sleek black dress stepped inside, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Detective Harris," she said, her voice clipped. "I'm Sarah Whitman from the American Embassy."
I'd
like a word with my client. Harris stood, nodding politely. "Of course. I'll leave you to it." As Harris left the room, Karen's bravado returned. She leaned back in her chair, smirking. "About time someone came to help me." Sarah didn't smile. She placed a folder on the table and sat down. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she began, her tone professional, "do you have any idea what kind of mess you've created?" Karen frowned, taken aback. "Excuse me? Aren't you here to help me?" "I'm here to advise." "You," Sarah corrected, her voice firm. "And my first piece of advice is to stop talking and start listening. You've embarrassed yourself, your country, and the embassy with your actions today. This is serious." Karen's mouth opened and closed, her indignation momentarily silenced. Sarah leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "You're facing charges of attempted theft, resisting arrest, and possibly more. The media is running wild with this story, and public opinion is not on your
side.
If you don't start cooperating, things will only get worse." Karen swallowed hard, her defiance faltering. For the first time, the weight of her actions seemed to sink in. But before she could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. "What is it?" Karen asked nervously. Sarah looked up, her tone cold. "The palace is issuing a statement." Karen's stomach dropped. The statement would only add fuel to the fire, and whatever came next was bound to escalate the situation even further. Sarah's phone screen illuminated with the official Buckingham Palace
statement.
The elegant crest of the royal family adorned the top of the page, but the words beneath it were anything but gentle. Earlier today, an individual breached protocol by attempting to interfere with an armed member of the Queen's
Guard.
This act endangered public safety and disrupted the operations of the palace. The royal family trusts that the appropriate legal measures will be taken to ensure such behavior is not repeated. The security of our staff and visitors remains our highest priority. The final line made Sarah's face tighten. "We will be cooperating fully with law enforcement to resolve this matter." She lowered her phone and fixed Karen with an icy stare. "They're not letting this slide."
Karen
slumped back in her chair, her bravado cracking. "It's just words," she said, though her voice lacked the usual confidence. "They're not going to do anything serious. I didn't actually hurt anyone." Sarah leaned forward, her voice
sharp.
"You don't get it, do you? The royal family is the heart of this country. This is about more than what you did. It's about what you represent to them. A foreigner defying their traditions, challenging their security, and now embarrassing their institution? You've stepped into a political minefield." Karen shifted uncomfortably. "Okay, fine. What do I do now?" Sarah sighed, pulling a legal pad from her folder. "First, you stop talking to anyone except me. No more outbursts, no more justifying yourself. Second, I'll do my best to negotiate with the authorities, but you need to cooperate fully." Karen's defiance flared briefly. "Cooperate? Like groveling and apologizing? If you want to avoid serious charges, yes," Sarah snapped. "Or you can keep acting like a victim and make everything worse for yourself." Karen looked away, her jaw tightening. The room was silent for a long moment before Sarah's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it and frowned.
"The
police want you to provide an official statement now." Karen sat up straighter, panic flickering across her face.
"Now? I'm
not ready." "You should have thought about that before you acted," Sarah said bluntly. She stood, straightened her blazer, and headed for the door. "I'll be outside. Remember, say nothing unless I tell you to." The door opened and Detective Harris entered, his expression unreadable. He set a recorder on the table and sat down. Mrs. Hawthorne, this is your opportunity to give your side of the story. I'd advise you to choose your words carefully. Karen's palms were clammy as she looked at the device. She glanced toward the door where Sarah stood, arms crossed and watching her closely.
Taking a
deep breath, Karen launched into her version of events. I was just curious. I didn't mean to cause any harm. I thought the guards were just, I don't know, ceremonial. I didn't think they'd react so harshly. Harris raised an eyebrow. You didn't think lunging for a rifle in a crowded public space would provoke a response? Karen hesitated. I wasn't lunging. I wanted to see if it was real. It's not like I was going to use it or anything. Harris leaned back in his chair, his face impassive. Whether or not you intended to use it is irrelevant. You interfered with an armed soldier on duty. That's a serious breach of security. Karen's temper flared. Oh, come on. This is being blown way out of proportion. It's not like I'm some kind of criminal. Harris exchanged a glance with Sarah, who pinched the bridge of her nose in frustration. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said carefully, are you aware of how many people were endangered by your actions today? Karen opened her mouth to argue, but he continued before she could interrupt.
What?
If the guard had perceived you as a genuine threat? What if his reaction had been more severe? Or worse, what if someone in the crowd panicked and caused a stampede? You didn't just endanger yourself, you put everyone around you at risk.
Karen
blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. For the first time, the reality of the situation began to sink in. But just as she was about to respond, the door to the interrogation room opened. A uniformed officer stepped in, his face grim. Detective Harris, there's been a development. Harris frowned and stood. What kind of development? The officer hesitated, glancing at Karen. You should see this. Sarah and Harris exchanged a glance before following the officer out.
Karen left.
Alone in the room, felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She could hear murmured voices outside, but couldn't make out the words. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Were they planning to press more charges? Had the royal family escalated their involvement? Minutes felt like hours before Sarah returned, her expression unreadable. She closed the door and sat across from Karen. What's going on? Karen demanded, her voice tinged with panic. Sarah's tone was calm, but serious. It seems your story has gained more traction than we thought. Someone's come forward claiming they interacted with you earlier in the day, and it's not in your favor. Karen's stomach dropped. What are you talking about? Sarah hesitated, then continued. The black couple you spoke to before the incident?
They've made a statement about your
behavior. They're alleging that you directed racially charged comments toward them. Karen's face turned red. That's ridiculous. I didn't say anything racist. They've submitted video evidence, Sarah said flatly. It's already spreading online. Karen's head spun. She thought back to her interaction with the couple, remembering her dismissive tone and the way she'd brushed off their remarks. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, in the harsh light of the interrogation room, it didn't look good. I didn't mean anything by it, she said weakly. They're twisting my words. Sarah
sighed.
Intent doesn't matter here. Perception does. And right now, public perception isn't on your side. Before Karen could respond, the door opened again, and Detective Harris re-entered. His face was stern as he set down a stack of papers. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said, we're adding a formal charge of incitement to public unrest. Based on witness statements and video evidence, it's clear your behavior was not only reckless, but inflammatory. Karen's heart sank.
She
wanted to argue, to protest, but for the first time, she realized the depth of the hole she had dug for herself.
And as
Harris began outlining the next steps, Karen couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of her troubles. Karen sat frozen in the chair, her mind struggling to process the words, formal charge. Her hands trembled as she looked at Sarah, who was busy scribbling notes in the folder before her. Detective Harris stood, his expression unchanged, and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her embassy representative. "This is insane," Karen muttered. "I didn't incite anything. They're just twisting everything I did." Sarah looked up, her expression a mix of exhaustion and frustration. "Karen, stop talking. Every time you open your mouth, you make things worse." Karen's face flushed with anger. "I thought you were supposed to help me." "I am helping you," Sarah shot back. "But helping you doesn't mean blindly
defending you.
It means managing the mess you've created and making sure you don't bury yourself further." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but Sarah held up a hand. "You need to focus. This charge is serious. The video evidence makes it worse. If we're going to salvage this, you need to stop acting like the victim." Karen swallowed her words, a knot forming in her stomach. "What do we do now?" Sarah sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I'm going to negotiate with the authorities to minimize the charges. But they're going to want something in return." Karen frowned. "Like what?" "A public apology," Sarah said bluntly. "A sincere one." Karen scoffed. "I don't see why I should apologize. This whole thing is blown out of proportion. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "That attitude right there is why you're in this mess. Whether or not you meant to hurt anyone doesn't matter. What matters is how your actions were perceived and the consequences they caused. If you refuse to take responsibility, this situation will spiral out of control." Karen slumped in her chair, staring at the table. The idea of apologizing publicly felt like admitting defeat, something she had never been good at. But as Sarah's words sank in, she realized she didn't have many options. Meanwhile, outside the station, the scene was growing more chaotic. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the viral story and the media frenzy surrounding it. Reporters jostled for position, microphones and cameras aimed at anyone who might give them a soundbite. Protesters held signs, some supporting the guards and the palace, others condemning Karen's actions as emblematic of entitlement and
privilege.
The black couple who had come forward earlier stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the commotion. The man, Daniel, looked uneasy as his wife, Lydia, scrolled through her phone. "Look at this," Lydia said, showing him the comments. "On a news article. This Karen thinks she owns the world. Entitlement at its finest. Deport her. It's everywhere." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't think it would blow up like this." "She brought it on herself," Lydia said firmly. "Maybe now she'll think twice about how she treats people."
Daniel sighed.
"I don't know. This feels messy.
Like
it's getting out of hand." Lydia frowned but didn't respond. She looked back at the station where more officers were arriving to manage the growing crowd. Inside, Sarah had stepped out to meet with Detective Harris and the Crown Prosecution Service representative. Karen sat alone, her mind racing. She replayed the events over and over, trying to convince herself she had been misunderstood. But deep down, a small voice nagged at her, whispering that she had crossed a line. "Sarah, we'll report this to the authorities. Could be a troll, but don't take chances.
Keep your
phone close and let me know if anything else happens." Karen exhaled shakily, feeling a small sense of relief. At least someone else knew now. But the relief was short-lived. She couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was behind the emails was serious. Later that day, Karen arrived at the embassy for her meeting with Sarah. The building was heavily guarded, a stark reminder of the tension surrounding her situation. Sarah met her in the lobby and escorted her to a private office. "We've reported the emails to the police," Sarah said, closing the door behind them. "They'll investigate, but these things can take time." Karen sat down, her anxiety bubbling to the surface. What if it's not just some troll? What if it's someone from the crowd? Or one of those protesters? Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Karen, I understand you're
scared.
but for now, There's no evidence to suggest you're in any immediate danger. The best thing you can do is stay vigilant and avoid engaging with anyone online. Karen nodded, though her nerves were far from settled. What about the palace? Have they said anything else? Sarah hesitated. No official statement yet, but sources say they're monitoring the situation closely. They want to see how the public responds to your apology before deciding on their next move.
Karen
Groaned, leaning back in her chair. So, I'm just supposed to wait? While everyone tears me apart online? Sarah's gaze was steady. You made a mistake, Karen. And now you're dealing with the fallout. The only way out of this is to show people you've learned from it. Karen didn't respond. She knew Sarah was right, but the weight of it all felt unbearable.
That
night, back at her hotel, Karen tried to distract herself with TV, but her mind kept drifting back to the emails.
She
checked her phone repeatedly, half expecting another message to appear. When nothing came, she started to relax until there was a knock at the door. Her body tensed. She hadn't ordered room service, and Sarah hadn't mentioned anyone coming to see her. The knock came again, louder this time. Karen crept to the door, peering through the peephole. A man in a hoodie stood outside, his face partially obscured. Her heart pounded as he knocked a third time, his movements more insistent. Miss Hawthorne, the man called, his voice muffled. We need to talk. Karen backed away from the door, her breathing shallow. She grabbed her phone and dialed Sarah's number, her hands shaking. Sarah, she whispered when the call connected. Someone's outside my door.
What?
Who? Sarah's voice was sharp. I don't know, Karen said, her voice rising. He's knocking and saying he needs to talk to me. Stay where you are, Sarah instructed. I'm calling security. Don't open the door. Karen nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. She backed into the corner of the room, clutching her phone like a lifeline as the knocking continued. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped.
Karen
held her breath, listening intently. The silence was almost worse than the noise. Moments later, there was a soft thud, something sliding under the door. Karen crept forward cautiously, her heart racing. A single piece of paper lay on the floor, folded neatly. She hesitated before picking it up, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The note contained only 4 words, scrawled in jagged handwriting. We're not finished yet. Karen's scream echoed through the room. Karen stumbled back, clutching the note in her trembling hands. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of those 4 ominous words
sank in.
We're not finished yet. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the distant hum of traffic outside her hotel room. Her phone buzzed in her hand, snapping her out of her frozen panic. Sarah's voice came through the speaker, sharp and urgent. Karen, are you there? What's happening? Karen could barely get the words out. There's a note.
Someone
slid it under my door. It says, her voice cracked. It says they're not finished. Sarah cursed under her breath.
Lock
the door and stay away from it. Security and the police are on their way. Don't touch anything else. Karen dropped the note on the bed as though it were a venomous snake and backed into the farthest corner of the room. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like the walls were closing in on her. The silence outside her door was deafening, every creak of the building making her flinch. Minutes later, a heavy knock came, making Karen jump. But this time, it was followed by a reassuring
voice.
Hotel security. Ms. Hawthorne, we're here to assist. Karen hesitated, then crept to the peephole to confirm.
2
uniformed guards and a police officer stood outside. She unlatched the door with shaky hands, cracking it open just enough to see them clearly. The officer nodded at her. You're safe now. May we come in? Karen opened the door and stepped aside. As they entered, one of the guards immediately checked the hallway, while the other examined the area around her door. The officer turned to Karen, his voice calm but firm. Can you tell me what happened? Karen recounted the events in halting sentences, her voice trembling. She gestured to the note on the bed. The officer retrieved it with gloved hands, his eyes narrowing as he read the message. "Have you received any other direct threats like this?" he asked. Karen nodded.
Emails. Dozens of them.
"I forwarded them to my embassy representative." The officer exchanged a glance with one of the security
Guards.
"We'll need to see those as well. For now, we'll review the hotel surveillance footage to identify the person who left this note." Karen's stomach churned. What if they're still here? In the buildings? The officer's jaw tightened. "We'll search the premises thoroughly. In the meantime, we're relocating you to a secure floor." Within an hour, Karen was moved to a different room, flanked by hotel security and 2 plainclothes officers. Her new accommodations were smaller, more isolated, and equipped with a private elevator accessible only with a keycard. Sarah arrived shortly after, her face set in a grim expression. She took one look at Karen and sighed. "You're a mess." Karen glared at her. "You think?" Sarah ignored the sarcasm and sat down across from her. "The police are taking this seriously. They're analyzing the note and the emails. But I need you to be honest with me. Are you sure you don't know who might be behind this?" Karen shook her head. "I have no idea. It could be anyone. People hate me because of what happened at the palace. The protesters, the internet trolls. I don't know." Sarah studied her, her expression unreadable. "Do you think this is connected to the black couple? They've been vocal about their side of the story. Could this be someone acting on their behalf?" Karen's eyes widened. "You think they'd send someone after me?" "I'm not saying that," Sarah replied quickly. "But this situation has stirred a lot of emotions. People act irrationally when they feel wronged." Karen slumped in her chair, rubbing her temples. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. This whole thing just spiraled out of control." "That doesn't matter now," Sarah said bluntly. "What matters is keeping you safe and resolving this." As the night stretched on, Karen found herself unable to sleep. Every shadow seemed menacing, every sound amplified in the silence. She checked her phone compulsively, half expecting another email or text to appear. When nothing came, she tried to convince herself that the worst was over. But deep down, she knew better. The next morning, Karen was summoned back to the embassy for another meeting. As she stepped into the conference room, she was greeted by Sarah, Detective Harris, and 2 other officials she didn't recognize. The atmosphere was tense. "Miss Hawthorne," Harris began, his tone serious, "we've reviewed the surveillance footage from the hotel. The individual who delivered the note wore a hoodie and kept their face obscured. We're still trying to identify them, but we've found something else, something concerning." Karen's throat tightened. "What?" Harris slid a tablet across the table. It displayed a series of still images from a different angle of the hotel's security cameras. One image showed the hooded figure entering the elevator. Another showed them exiting onto Karen's floor. But the final image sent a chill down her spine. It showed the figure standing outside her door, their hand raised as though about to knock. But what made the image unsettling was the way they were positioned, leaning slightly forward, as if listening for movement inside the room. Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "They were waiting?" Harris nodded. "It appears so. And this wasn't the first time. We've identified the same figure lingering in the lobby the night before." Karen's hands gripped the edge of the table. "You think they've been following me?" "It's possible," Harris said. "Which is why we're increasing security measures. But there's something else you need to know." He tapped the tablet, pulling up another image, this one of the note itself. The jagged handwriting had been enhanced, revealing faint indentations from other writing underneath. "The lab analyzed the note," Harris explained. "It looks like whoever wrote it pressed down hard enough to leave impressions from previous pages they'd written on. We're working to reconstruct those now." Karen's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" Harris's face darkened. "It means this person may have written other notes And based on the depth of the indentations, those notes could be threats, possibly to other people. By the end of the meeting, Karen's nerves were frayed. The thought of someone following her, plotting against her, was more than she could handle. As she was escorted back to her secure hotel room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That night, as she tried to sleep, a sound startled her awake. A faint tapping, soft but insistent, echoed through the quiet room. She froze, her heart pounding. The tapping came again, this time louder. It was coming from the window. Karen's breath caught as she turned slowly, her eyes darting to the curtains. The tapping persisted, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone trying to get her attention. Summoning her courage, Karen grabbed her phone and crept toward the window. Her hands trembled as she pulled the curtain aside and found herself staring directly into the face of the hooded figure. Karen screamed, stumbling back and dropping her phone. The hooded figure pressed a gloved hand against the glass, tilting their head slightly as if studying her reaction. Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out all other sounds. Fumbling, she grabbed her phone and called Sarah.
Her voice was barely
coherent as she stammered, "They're here. At my window." Sarah's response was sharp and immediate. "Get away from the window. Lock yourself in the bathroom and stay there. I'm calling the police right now." Karen bolted to the bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. She crouched by the sink, shaking uncontrollably as she clutched her phone.
From
the other side of the room, she heard the faint, ominous tapping continue. It was relentless, deliberate, like a countdown to something she didn't want to imagine. The police arrived in minutes, storming the building with tactical precision. Karen didn't dare leave the bathroom until an officer knocked on the door, identifying himself. When she emerged, her face pale and tear-streaked, the officers were scouring the room. One stood by the window, examining the exterior with a flashlight. The officer in charge approached her. "We've secured the perimeter, but whoever it was is gone. There's no sign of forced entry, and the window doesn't open from the outside." "Did you see their face?" Karen shook her head, her voice trembling. "They were wearing a hood." "I couldn't see anything." The officer nodded grimly. "We'll review the hotel's security footage again, but it seems this person knows how to avoid being seen. For now, we'll have guards stationed outside your room and monitoring the hotel." Karen felt a wave of despair. Even surrounded by security, she didn't feel safe. The image of the hooded figure's hand pressed against the glass was burned into her mind. The following morning, Karen was summoned back to the embassy for another meeting. Her exhaustion was evident, dark circles under her eyes, her movements sluggish. Sarah greeted her with a steaming cup of coffee, her expression softer than usual. "Rough night?" she asked. Karen shot her a look. "What do you think?" Sarah didn't push. She led Karen into a conference room where Detective Harris and another officer were waiting. Harris wasted no time getting to the point. "We've made progress on the note," he said, pulling out a sheet of paper with enhanced images. "The indentations we found suggest the writer had drafted multiple messages, not just the one you received. We've reconstructed a few lines." He slid the paper across the table. Karen's stomach churned as she read the reconstructed text. "She thinks she can get away with this. Make her understand the consequences. There are others who deserve to know what she's done." Karen looked up, her face ashen. "What does this mean? Others who deserve to know?" Harris folded his hands. "It suggests the sender has been watching you closely. They may have targeted others who were involved in the incident, or people they perceive as connected to it." Karen's mind raced. "The black couple. Do you think they're in danger?" "It's possible," Harris admitted. "We've already reached out to them and advised caution. But for now, the focus is on ensuring your safety." After the meeting, Karen was escorted back to her hotel under heavy security. Despite the assurances, her paranoia grew with every passing hour. She jumped at small sounds, double-checked every lock, and barely ate. Her world had shrunk to the confines of her room, and even there, she felt
trapped.
That evening, Sarah called to check in. "The police are doing everything they can," she said, her tone reassuring. "And remember, you're not alone. If anything happens, you call me immediately." Karen nodded absently, her gaze fixed on the window. She didn't tell Sarah about the new email she'd received that afternoon, a single line that sent chills down her spine. "Tonight, we finish this." As night fell, Karen's anxiety reached a breaking point. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified. She sat on the bed, clutching her phone like a life. The room was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt like it was holding its breath. And then it happened. The power went out. Karen froze, the sudden darkness swallowing her room. Her breath quickened as she fumbled for her phone's flashlight. The beam of light cut through the blackness, but it only heightened her sense of vulnerability. A loud thud came from the hallway, followed by muffled voices. Karen scrambled to the corner of the room, her flashlight trembling in her hands. She tried to call Sarah, but the call wouldn't connect. Her heart sank as she realized the outage might have affected the building's cellular network.
The
thudding grew louder, closer, until it stopped directly outside her door. Karen held her breath, every muscle in her body tense. Then came the knock. It was slow, deliberate, each impact echoing through the room. Karen's flashlight flickered as her hands shook uncontrollably. "Miss Hawthorne," a voice called from the other side. It was calm, almost soothing. "I just want to talk." Karen didn't move, her mind racing. The voice sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. "I know you're scared," the voice continued. "But running won't help you. You need to face what you've done." Karen's panic gave way to confusion. "What I've done," she whispered to herself. The voice grew sharper, more insistent. "You can't hide from this."
Karen.
"You think an apology will fix everything? You think you can walk away unscathed?" Karen's breathing hitched. Whoever this was, they knew everything about her. The door handle jiggled, and Karen screamed, "Leave me alone." The voice outside
paused.
Then, almost as if mocking her, it said, "Oh, Karen, we're just getting started." In the hallway, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the tension. A team of officers burst onto the floor, shouting commands. The figure outside Karen's door bolted, their footsteps fading into the distance. Inside the room, Karen collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. The officers broke down the door moments later, finding her huddled in the corner, tears streaming down her face. "They were here," she whispered. "They were right here." The officers searched the building, but the figure had vanished without a trace. Karen was left with one burning question. Who was behind this? And why were they so intent on destroying her life? As she was escorted out of the building under police protection, a chilling realization struck her. This wasn't just about the palace incident. It was personal, and whoever was behind it wasn't going to stop. Until they got what they wanted, Karen was ushered into a secure vehicle, flanked by 2 armed officers. The once bustling streets of London felt like an ominous maze as the car wove its way through the city. Karen's mind raced, replaying the
voice from the hallway.
It was calm, yet filled with an unnerving authority. That voice wasn't just some internet troll.
It
belonged to someone with a personal vendetta. Beside her, Sarah was typing furiously on her phone, coordinating with the embassy and law enforcement. She glanced at Karen, who was staring out the window, her face pale. "We're taking you to a safe house," Sarah said. "It's in a private location, heavily guarded. You'll stay there until we figure out who's behind
this."
Karen barely acknowledged her, her thoughts consumed by fear. "They knew everything about me," she muttered.
"They
knew what I did, what I said, even my apology." Sarah sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "This person is clearly watching you closely, but we'll figure out how. For now, focus on staying safe." The safe house was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by a high fence and equipped with cameras on every corner. Karen was led inside, where two officers explained the security measures in place. There was no direct line to the outside world except through a monitored phone provided by the police. Karen dropped onto the couch in the living room, exhaustion seeping into her bones. The weight of the past few days was unbearable, and the constant fear gnawed at her sanity. Sarah sat across from her, studying her closely. "You need to tell me if there's anything you haven't shared about this situation. People don't just go to these lengths without a reason." Karen hesitated, her mind flashing back to the black couple she had argued with at the palace. Could this be connected to them? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. They seemed annoyed by her, but they didn't strike her as vengeful. "I've told you everything," Karen said finally. "I don't know why this is happening." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we're dealing with someone who has their own twisted motives. The police are doing everything they can, but we need to be ready for anything." Hours turned into a restless
night.
Karen lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house sending a jolt of fear through her.
The
silence was suffocating, and her thoughts spiraled into worst-case scenarios. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she grabbed it instinctively, her heart leaping. It was a message from an unknown number. "Did you think a safe house would save you?" Karen's blood ran cold. She bolted upright, her hands trembling as she dialed Sarah's number. The line rang twice before Sarah answered, her voice groggy. "What is it?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper.
"They messaged me again."
"They know I'm here." There was a pause, and Karen could hear Sarah moving quickly. "Stay where you are. I'm coming over." With the police. Karen hung up, her breath coming in short gasps. She felt trapped, the walls of the house closing in around her. She checked the locks on the doors and windows, her paranoia mounting. And then she heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps on gravel. Karen froze, her ears straining to catch any noise. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Someone was outside. She grabbed a lamp from the nightstand, clutching it tightly as she crept toward the front door. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling like an eternity. She peeked through the peephole, but the porch was empty. The sound shifted to the side of the house, near the living room windows. Karen's breath hitched as she moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtains. Her fingers tightened around the lamp as she risked a
quick glance.
A shadow moved across the yard. Karen's grip on the lamp tightened. She debated calling Sarah again, but stopped herself. The police were already on their way. All she had to do was wait. But as the minutes dragged on, the sound of footsteps seemed to circle the house, deliberate and taunting. When Sarah and the police finally arrived, the house was eerily silent. Karen flung open the door, her face pale and tear-streaked. "They were here," she blurted.
"I
heard them walking around the house." The officers fanned out, searching the property with flashlights. Sarah stayed with Karen, her expression grim. "You're sure it wasn't your imagination?" Karen glared at her. "I know what I heard. They were outside." The lead officer returned moments later, shaking his head. No sign of anyone. No footprints, no forced entry.
"If
they were here, they're gone now." Karen slumped onto the couch, her fear replaced by frustration. "They're playing games. With me. They know exactly how to mess with my head." Sarah sat beside her, her voice low. "Whoever this is, they're escalating. We need to figure out what they want before they make their next move." The next morning, Karen woke to find Sarah and Detective Harris deep in conversation. Harris looked up as she entered the room, his expression serious.
"We've
traced the phone number from the text message," he said. "It's a burner phone, untraceable. But we found something else." He pulled out a file and handed it to Karen. Inside were printed screenshots of social media posts, dozens of them.
Each.
One was a comment or message referencing Karen, some angry, others threatening. But one in particular stood out.
It was.
From a newly created account, the profile picture a blank silhouette. The post read, "You'll never escape the consequences of what you did." Karen stared at the post, her hands trembling. What I did? What does that even mean? Harris's jaw tightened. We think this person believes you've wronged them somehow. This isn't just about the palace incident. There's something deeper. Karen's mind raced, her memories blurring together. Had she done something to someone in her past?
Said.
Something she didn't realize had hurt someone? Before she could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her face paled. What is it? Karen asked, her voice shaky. Sarah turned the phone toward her. It was a news alert, the headline glaring in bold letters. Couple involved in Royal Guard incident receives threats. Connection to Karen. Hawthorne. Karen's stomach dropped. The article detailed how Daniel and Lydia, the black couple from the palace, had received anonymous threats in the days following their public statements. They're being dragged into this, Sarah said, grimly. And whoever is behind it is using them to send a message. Karen felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just about her anymore. Someone was pulling strings, and the web they were weaving was growing darker by the second.
Karen
stared at the headline on Sarah's phone, her mind reeling. The room felt like it was spinning as she struggled to grasp the implications. Not only was she being targeted, but now the black couple, Daniel and Lydia, were caught in the crossfire. This is insane, she whispered. Why would they go after them? They didn't do anything. Sarah's face was grim. Because they're connected to the palace incident. Whoever is behind this is creating a narrative, one that's spiraling out of control. Detective Harris cleared his throat, drawing their attention. We've already reached out to Daniel and Lydia. They've agreed to meet with us at a secure location. They're scared, but they want to help us figure out who's doing
this.
Karen's heart sank. She remembered the sharpness in Lydia's voice at the palace, the way she had dismissed Karen's comments as ignorant. The idea that her actions had now put them in danger made her stomach churn.
When? Karen asked, softly.
This afternoon, Harris replied. You'll come with us. We need to piece this together, and they might have information that could help. The meeting was held in a private conference room at a secure police station. Karen entered, cautiously, her eyes immediately landing on Daniel and Lydia. They were seated at the far end of the room, their expressions wary. Daniel's arms were crossed tightly over his chest, while Lydia's eyes were sharp and unyielding. Karen hesitated, unsure of what to say. Before she could speak, Lydia's voice cut through the tense silence. I hope you know what kind of mess you've dragged us into. Karen flinched, her face flushing with guilt. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Lydia's gaze didn't waver. Whether you meant it or not, it's happening. We've been getting emails, calls, even people showing up at our house. All because of you. Daniel placed a calming hand on Lydia's arm, his voice quieter, but no less firm. We want to help figure this out, but you need to start being honest. Why would someone target you and us? Karen sat down, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I don't know, she admitted. I've been getting threats. 2 notes, emails, even someone outside my hotel window. I don't know who they are or what they want. Lydia narrowed her
eyes.
You're sure this isn't someone you've crossed before? Someone you upset? Karen shook her head, her voice trembling. I've been racking my brain. I can't think of anyone who would go this far. Harris intervened, his tone measured. Let's focus on what we do know. The threats to Ms. Hawthorne escalated after the palace incident, and the same seems to be true for you too. It's clear the person behind this sees a connection between you. Lydia snorted. The connection is obvious. She made a fool of herself at the palace, and we called her out. Now someone's using that to stir up trouble. Daniel frowned. But why take it this far? It doesn't make sense. As the discussion continued, an officer entered the room, handing Harris a file. He opened it, his expression darkening as he scanned the contents. What is it? Sarah asked. Harris set the file on the table. We've traced the burner phone used to send the threats. It was purchased at a store just 2 blocks from the hotel Miss Hawthorne was staying at. Karen's breath hitched. So they were following me from the start? Looks that way, Harris replied. But here's the twist. The person who bought the phone used a fake name, but the store clerk remembered them. They said the buyer seemed familiar. Lydia leaned forward, her brow furrowing. Familiar how? Harris hesitated, then turned to Karen. The clerk said the buyer had an accent. American? Karen's jaw dropped. Wait, you're saying this could be someone from the US? It's possible, Harris said. The question is why someone from your own country would target you and involve these two in the process. Hours later, Karen returned to the safe house, her mind buzzing with questions. An American? Someone familiar? She racked her brain, trying to piece together any interaction, any fleeting connection that might explain this. But nothing made sense. As the sun set, her phone buzzed with another email. Her stomach churned as she opened it, half expecting another cryptic threat. But this message was different. Time's up. Meet me where it all began. Karen's blood ran cold. She immediately forwarded the email to Sarah and Harris, who called her within minutes. Where it all began, Harris said. They're referring to the palace. They want to lure you there. Karen's voice shook. You can't seriously expect me to go. Harris's tone was firm. No one's asking you to go alone. This is the best lead we've had. We'll set up a team and monitor the area closely. If this person shows up, we'll take them
down.
Karen's instincts screamed against it, but she knew there was no other option. This had to end. The next evening, Karen found herself standing outside Buckingham Palace once again. The crowd of tourists had thinned as night fell, leaving the area eerily quiet. She glanced around nervously, her every move shadowed by undercover officers stationed nearby. Her phone buzzed again. Another email, come to the East Gate. Alone. Karen showed the message to Harris, who
nodded.
We'll be close. Stay in the open. With her heart pounding, Karen walked toward the East Gate. The palace loomed above her, its grandeur now tinged with menace. She stopped near the gate, scanning the area for any sign of the hooded figure. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. Karen turned sharply, her breath catching as the figure stepped into the light. This time, they weren't hiding. It was the cafe server, the young man she had snapped at on her first morning in London. Karen's jaw dropped. You? The man smiled coldly, his eyes gleaming with malice. You didn't think I'd forget, did you? The way you talked to me, dismissed me like I was nothing. Karen's mind reeled. This is about that?
A
comment I made. No, he said, his voice low and venomous. It's about people like you. People who think they can walk through life stepping on others, never facing the consequences. You made a scene and I saw an opportunity to show the world what you really are. Karen took a step back, her voice trembling. This is insane. You dragged other people into this. They needed to see the truth, he said, his tone sharp. But don't worry. Tonight, the world will know exactly who you are. Before Karen could respond, the man reached into his jacket. But before he could act, officers swarmed him, pinning him to the ground. Karen stumbled back, watching as he was cuffed and hauled to his feet, his calm facade replaced by fury. You think this is over? He spat, glaring at Karen. This is just the beginning. Karen watched him being dragged away, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Harris approached her, his voice steady. It's over. You're safe.
Now?
But as Karen stared at the spot where the man had stood, a chilling realization gripped her. His words, his obsession, it wasn't just about her. It was about something deeper, something she couldn't fully understand. And she wasn't sure it was over.